Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the R3 Podcast, Rescue, Rebuild, Restore. This is a joint venture between Operation Restored Warrior and Encounter Online. I'm Shane, back again, and I'm here with Rich Dunn this week. I got a chance to interview him not too long ago for a video that you can see. I'll put a link in the bio, but it turned out to be a fantastic video. Rich, you're a great guy, and I love your story. Rich Dunn is the campus pastor of Hope Church in upstate South Carolina. More importantly, he has a wife and 4 daughters, and he's just a fantastic guy. Rich, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, you've just got such a great story because, we talk a lot about the drop zone experience that Operation Restored Warrior has. And the reason is because we're all about rescue, rebuild, restore. A lot of people may look good on the outside, but inside they've got some serious wounds that in some ways are crippling them, and they need to be rescued and rebuilt and restored to God's purposes for them and fullness of life. And this, as you know really well, this program was pioneered with our nation's military in mind. And thousands of soldiers have gone through and gotten healing from PTSD and suicide ideation. And yet you are neither a veteran nor an active duty. You're a pastor. How did you come to be involved in a drop zone program?
Well, first of all, I have a built-in counselor in my life. My wife's a counselor. And so she's
probably a double-edged sword there.
It is. It's a double-edged sword. However, having her in my life has challenged me to probably go to places in my heart that I didn't think I needed to go or should go. As if, one and done, that happened, I can move on. So when I kind of fast forward a little bit after a number of years of marriage, my wife and I had gone to some different conferences. We'd gone to some things where we'd had some inner healing. And again, you're working through things in your life and it's good. You're kind of on this journey. You don't ever really totally arrive in this life, but you're on a journey. And my journey ended up crossing paths with a guy by the name of Mark Patrick. And he had moved from Colorado, was friends, unbeknownst to me, with Paul Lavelle, who's the founder of Operation Restored Warrior. And he had just brought it to our attention because he was part of a small group that I was connected with, and said, hey, we need just to go out and just kind of see what that would look like to maybe build some kind of symbiotic, synergistic type relationship. All right. So we were like, sure, let's do it. So myself, another friend of ours, Josh, and Mark, we flew out to Colorado, really to connect with another ministry that was doing some cool stuff, which we did connect with them. But at the same time, we had this afternoon and Mark had reached out to Paul. Paul said, yeah, come on over. And we, at that juncture, met Paul Lavelle. And he started unpacking the story, first his personal story, where he came from.
Which is a great story, man.
It's a phenomenal story. And then he started sharing about what he saw with just kind of leveling the playing field of recognizing, yes, Operation Restored Warrior was focused primarily on active duty and veterans in the armed forces, but recognizing there was a need to see hearts of men healed also that were not in that particular line of work. And so it opened a conversation, and it was really out of that where we decided, hey, what does it look like to do something with civilian and non-civilian online? Because that was something Operation Restored Warrior had. So that began the journey. So we went through it together. Now, Mark Patrick had been a facilitator with Paul in Operation Restored Warrior, so he was bringing a level of expertise and insight. And then by having Paul and other guys that they've connected with, I felt like we were really surrounded with such caliber people to do it. So it wasn't us deciding, hey, we're going to pilot this and see if it works. There'd been some other people that had done it.
Right.
We just felt we needed to be very intentional. So as I started going down this path and went through it the first time online, because we took ourselves through it, Mark helped facilitate it, I started seeing some stuff coming up in me that perhaps I thought I dealt with.
Oh, that's the way it works.
One of the things that came up in me was not realizing, and my wife would allude to this, but I would, as maybe I'm the only husband that would be dismissive of my wife's insights, but I was guilty. She would say, Rich, I think you're struggling with some really PTSD stuff. And I'm like, come on, what are you talking about? But my background, having grown up where I did, my parents were missionaries. We lived in West Africa for a chunk of time. We'd gone through a number of government overthrows and different things. We'd seen a lot of things happening in the streets. Our life was hanging in the balance at different times. But I never thought that really affected me. I kind of put that in a compartment, as guys do. I think, okay, that was then, this is now. So as I'm going through this online drop zone, I'm recognizing there's some of this coming up in me. And even Mark, as one of the key facilitators, was like, Rich, there's some junk you really need to deal with. And, of course, if I can put this in the proper context, maybe that pastor hat comes on, it's like, I got this, man. I walk plenty of people through these things, when in reality, God was wanting to bring me to deeper places of healing in that arena.
Wow, that's amazing. So you started this through the online program, and then that led to you going through in person. Is that right?
Right. So we went through the online program, what we would call our kind of tight-knit group of leaders of this men's small group. And because of what we saw happen in us, we decided it was important to potentially open it up, do another online where we would help facilitate. So we would use their online curriculum, but we'd also be pseudo facilitators in that mix. And we started off with 12 guys. We split them into 2 groups of 6, and we took them through a 4-day intensive online. And we took them off-site. We had a generous donor that provided a home for us to where we could accommodate 20-some people, facilitators, and those going through it. And so the second time around, we were going through it, but we were helping facilitate more this time. But again, even as a facilitator in this, quote unquote, there were things that were coming up in my heart and my life, whether it was dealing with things from core memories, lies that I believed about myself.
Yeah.
Everything from, I'm not worthy, or I'm not really a good dad. Whatever those things were that were really kind of bubbling up in me, that would come up as well. So that allowed us to consider what would be next. And that's where then I got a personal invitation. And I know on occasion, Operation Restored Warrior will open up a particular drop zone to civilian. And so I was given an opportunity to do that. And it was in March earlier this year that I was able to participate in a 5-day intensive drop zone with 5 other individuals. So besides myself, there was also an officer that was in the police force, but everybody else was either active or veteran. And it was intense.
Well, I'll dig into what does that mean, it was intense, in just a second. I want to clarify for those who are watching who may not understand what the drop zone is and some of these things he's talking about, like the online program. So Paul Lavelle, who he has mentioned, Rich has mentioned, founded Operation Restored Warrior 17-ish years ago.
Yeah, that's right.
And has been developing a program that you can only say is being done hand in hand with Jesus himself, of bringing healing, not counseling, not helpful tips, not meaningful support, but absolute healing to PTSD and suicide ideation for our nation's warriors. And that's something that people say can't be healed. You can mitigate, you can have some helpful tips, but you don't heal PTSD, you just manage it. But this is healing. And then through the course of many years, Paul and the team began to realize that many of these warriors that would come through the program, they may have some combat-related trauma that needs to be dealt with, that are heart wounds. But an overwhelming percentage of the time, these warriors brought their own wounds and drama into the combat experience through wounds in their childhood, relationship wounds. We say this all the time, you just don't go through this life without taking some hits. And
That's
so
right.
The reason that he has an online program to go to is because Operation Restored Warrior has just made a foundational shift. It's not a shift away from our nation's warriors, but it's a shift towards just the reality that everybody needs healing. And you may not have a way to get that healing if you're not a warrior. And so Operation Restored Warrior is making room for everybody now through their online programs and through group events, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So let's get back to you and your story. So you find yourself at a drop zone and it's intense. What is it like to show up? Give us pretend that nobody knows what a drop zone is. So kind of describe what you came into.
So my concept of a drop zone, because we had gone through the online program and had facilitated it as close as we knew best based on Mark's insight and Paul, some of their coaching, was different because now I'm connected to what they've been doing for year upon year upon years over these past 17 years, which is an intensive heart healing. That's how I would describe it, where they're going to dig into the heart of man, our hearts, and allow the Holy Spirit, God, to expose things that perhaps we thought we've dealt with, or we didn't realize were there. But as we're going through this drop zone, and again, it's a 5-day intensive. It's not for the faint of heart. It is something that even if you went in with certain expectations, I would say they're going to be exceeded for sure, but you're going to have to go to some areas that you probably don't want to go to. And as a guy, we like to bow up our chest and potentially be all that, like we got it together. And I'll never forget when I walked in that first afternoon. We call him Big John, but John Williams, he's the CEO of Operation Restored Warrior. He pulls me aside, and he's a big guy, so it was more of like yanking me aside in a good way.
Big John.
But he said, Rich, I just want you to know you're not a pastor here. You just need to be rich. And when he said that to me, it was so freeing.
Oh, right on.
Not that I went in with a pastor's hat. However, you can find yourself moving quickly into the role that you operate in on a regular basis. So that released me to just be me in that context. And it opened a door where I believe I ultimately allowed the Lord to say, God, do what you want to do in me during this time. I'm coming in really with a heart of saying, you know what I need more than I would ever know what I need.
Yeah.
And so that became just the mantra for those next 5 days.
Right on. Well, there are some, I don't want to call them trade secrets, but exactly what happens at the drop zone, we don't tend to go into very deeply outside of the drop zone. And it's because there are a lot of things you just have to experience. They either wouldn't make sense outside the context of the drop zone, or if you are a candidate to go through a drop zone, whether online or in person, you might be able to put up some barriers or go in with some preconceptions, which are just things you don't want to fool with. And so we're not going to get too deep into what exactly happened in the drop zone, but there is something called the healing prayer that is about half to 2/3 of the way through. And it's the moment that everyone talks about. And I'd love to hear you talk about some of the breakthrough, some of the revelations that I think perhaps were forecast by your wife in some areas that you needed to see some healing.
Yes. So when the healing prayer is brought to the table, a number of sessions in, you've been dealing with things throughout the previous couple days, and they're taking you to places, first of all, to better understand who you are as a man, this whole kind of masculine journey that you're on, and the challenges you face, the times that you've been knocked down, the times that there's been perhaps even hurts, father wounds. You can kind of go through the whole list. There's a lot of stuff there. And we don't have a lot of time to unpack that now. But you start finding yourself in this place of self-reflection. And there's moments where you're pausing, you're getting away for an hour plus at times just to allow God to speak to your heart with the premise of he's wanting to make our hearts whole. That's what his desire is that we would be fully whole to be used for him.
Yeah.
And his glory and purposes, to be the husband, the father, the leader, the servant that God wants us to be. So in this process, when you come to this place of the healing prayer, you've already been dealing with quite a few things, but there's this place where you recognize, okay, now how do I find healing in this? I've unpacked a lot of stuff, and it's almost like all this junk is kind of hanging out there. It's almost maybe in some cases low-hanging fruit. However, there's got to be a place to bury that stuff in a life-giving way.
Yeah.
And it really is where the healing prayer comes in, where a facilitator helps you just be able to walk through and unpack all the things that you've been dealing with, and you start seeing the very things that have plagued you, compromised you, challenged you in a non-life-giving way.
Yeah.
Just start dissipating. And it's in those places there becomes this wellspring of freedom and joy that starts to permeate. And it can manifest in different ways. I mean, sometimes there's just uncontrollable weeping. And for guys, whoa, hold on a second. We're talking about crying. But many times it's tears of joy because they realize, oh my goodness, this has held me back from being all that I knew I could be, but I didn't have the tools. I didn't have the pathway to find that freedom. And so when you're going through it with these other group of guys, there's a camaraderie that's being built too. It's like it's like your tribe. So it's not just Rich Dunn going through it, but it's me and the other guys. And you recognize, wow, there's a bond. There's this band of brothers, this band of hearts coming together going, hey, we're not in this alone. And we're able to just come to places of even empathizing and being able to recognize, like, I am on a journey, not alone, but with others as well. But God's in the lead, and there's hope. Like, there's real hope.
Yeah, it's just such a big deal. Kind of the premise of the drop zone experience. Oh, I'm terrible with addresses. Maybe you as a pastor know this address, no pressure if you don't. But there is, I believe it's a proverb, could be wrong, that says, guard your heart with all diligence, for from it is spring all the things of your life.
Yeah, it's Proverbs 4:23. It's one of those. Go. And not that there's plenty of scripture references I don't know. However, that one just has resonated so much with me because there's even how different versions will play it out, but it talks about how either all the issues of life flow out of it. And the importance of guarding your heart. And I think in the world that we live in, man, what a timely verse for just us to grab hold of and just chew on. So
I mean, everybody knows about the human heart. It's where you love, etc. You don't have to be a follower of Jesus to know about that. But as a follower of Jesus, hopefully you learn, although I was a follower of Jesus for 20 years without even knowing this, but the spiritual heart it's really a spiritual organ, and it has very unique and life-defining properties. And when that heart gets wounded, it affects, like the proverb says, all the issues of your life flow from it. And so it's like contaminating a well, and then the well from which you draw your water and from which you give your water to other people is just contaminated. And so that's what the drop zone is about, is bringing complete healing to the heart. And a lot of that happens during this event that we call the healing prayer.
That's correct.
So let's just fast forward to the end of the event, the end of your drop zone. Um, how can you describe where you were and what you brought back home as opposed to how you showed up?
I think the one thing that really struck me is when it was communicated to me on the front end, it's okay, Rich, for you just to be you here. So any identity that was wrapped up in what I do or what I give
Yeah.
myself to was left at the front door. And so when I walked in, we all had different identities, and there were different ones that had a certain amount of years they'd given to Army or Marines,
Police. Yeah.
whatever it was. Like it was just this thing. And it was like all of a sudden we were on a level playing field because we all had hurt in our heart. We'd all been knocked down multiple times. We've all had struggles, marital struggles, struggles with our kids,
Yeah.
feeling devalued, many times maybe feeling betrayed,
Yeah. It
father
affects
issues,
everything.
it affects everything. But yet we were on this level playing field. And as we were on this playing field, we had those around us, facilitators that were facilitating the sessions, but also praying for us before we even got there.
Yeah.
So there's this
Before
power of
they knew your
prayer.
name.
Yes. There's this power of prayer that I don't want to discount,
Yeah.
that, where we are literally being lifted up in prayer, that as we would come, that we would come with open hearts, that we would come to receive, and that we would own that.
Yeah.
We'd own our junk and we would own our healing.
Mm-hmm.
It was in those places that when I walked out of there, I walked out of there more footloose and fancy free, just like burdens had been lifted. And we can go to scripture and go, well, it says cast all your burdens at his feet. I get all that. But as a guy, many times it's not something we do practically.
Yeah.
We might talk it, but we don't necessarily walk it. And so I felt like in that drop zone, it was a place to walk it out with God and say, God, how do you really see me? What do you think of me? Right? Am I
Yeah.
really your, do you see me that way? But I've done this and I've done this and I've screwed up here and I've done all these things. And God just would speak so clearly. He goes, son, I love you. I make you whole. I define you. And it's in those places that when I walked out of there and even reconnected with my wife, it was this place of going, Rich, you're just in a different place. Just even how you respond to me. And
Wow.
it's one thing to say that, it's another thing to live it out 2 weeks from now, 3 months from now, 7 months from now. So that's been part of the story.
Yeah, that means it's actual foundational change.
That's
The
correct.
the heart from which all things flow has been healed. And then it's not like, well, how long can I keep this up? No, it's just different now.
That's right.
Yeah, that's really good. So let me explain to folks a little bit. I mentioned that Operation Restored Warrior wants to bring this opportunity for transformational breakthrough healing to everybody. And Rich mentioned the online programs. He's going to talk a little bit more about what it was like to do that as a group of people, but it's actually meant for an individual. That means you can right now go to this address, this website, www.operationrestoredwarrior.org. And right there on the front page, you'll find a button to click for the online programs. And I promise you, what Rich is describing is a journey that you can begin. Like now, I wouldn't be opposed to you like just turning off this podcast and going and logging on and beginning your online journey of healing. And it's free. There's just no barriers. Why not try it out? But you, Rich, had the novel approach of like, no, let's do this as a group of guys. So you kind of described what that was like. You've told us what it was like to receive your healing. What stories could you tell me about the guys who went through this program with you online? First, your leadership team, and then a bunch of people you invited.
So To start with the leadership team, which we call the cadre,
That's a good name.
yeah, a revolutionaries there, but and we're about that. We want to see hearts and lives revolutionized, so there's no question. However, as we were going through it, what we found again as a tribe going through this, knowing each other fairly well, but also recognizing we don't know every in and out of a person's
Yeah.
heart, where they're at. We started seeing breakthroughs in our group, in our cadre, like the different guys that didn't realize they were dealing with an abandonment issue, but
Wow.
everything, the lens they were looking through was through that lens of always feeling abandoned, left behind. And so that was powerful. There was another guy that had gone through it, and he'd had a really sad altercation with a good friend where a good friend had really almost tried to take his life when he wasn't really tracking God, which sounds
Wow.
extreme. And it was, but it had kept him from ever walking in places of leadership. He always looked at himself as less than because of what had happened with a good friend. And so there was these places that were coming up, these core memories, and God started bringing healing to these things. So that was in our initial group, the cadre. Then as then as we took months went by, we booked this other group, a group of 12 that we took through the online, and we were also helping facilitate that as well, besides the online, which was good. And the way we did it is each of us took one particular lesson that's part of the online and did our best to unpack it, perfect it, share personal story
Yeah.
to add to what was playing out
Yeah.
online.
Make it your own.
Make it your own, totally. And we had it's interesting. Every time we've done this, we've had probably 30 to 40% of the group that are veterans.
Oh, wow.
It's been real interesting. So
Hmm.
there's definitely a group of civilians, but I think it's because so many people have served in the armed forces over the past number of decades.
Yeah.
And those individuals are peppered into different congregations, friend groups, small groups. So we've just identified that. So we had two ex-Marines that were part of our second online drop zone. And just the healing they got. One
Wow.
guy was on the verge of saying, if this doesn't work, I'm ending it.
Yeah.
So we're talking suicidal, but God met him where he was at in such a real way. And then another guy just always felt as a deficit. He was abused as a kid, uh, just some crazy stuff in his life. So he had told himself, I'll never let that happen again. So, the course of action was to join the Marine Corps, walk that out,
Yeah.
hoorah, all that. However, he was broken inside. And so when he came to this online drop zone, there were things that started breaking in him, and he started getting healing, even to where his wife would say, like, where in the world did this guy come from? So those
Oh,
kind of
that's
things,
great.
you can't make up those kind of stories. That's where you're seeing fruit in the lives of men and again, there's a commitment. It's a challenge. However, when a guy says yes, God's yes is always bigger.
That's a good quote that you can expect me to steal. That's a really good quote. Now, this is such a fantastic story because not only did have you gone through the drop zone in person, which is a tight knit 6 person group, not only have you gone through the online program that's meant for individuals, yet you did it with a group. You took one more crazy step, and you decided, hey guys at ORW, could you actually come here and do an event? Would you talk about how that got formed?
So after the drop zone that I was invited to be a part of towards the end of March of 2024, I'd had a conversation with Jordan, one of the facilitators, great guy. And we'd been talking about what it would look like to maybe do something else. And Paul was a part of that conversation, as were most of the team from Operation Restored Warrior. What would it look like, since we had done some of the things that we had done? to do it potentially in a larger group. Operation Restored Warrior were willing to bring in some of their key facilitators that would be available for that time frame and do it more localized in the region that we live, and we're in the Carolinas. That just resonated with me. So within a week, I was on the phone to a couple different people. And for us, we were trying to find the right location that could work, because when you're going to do a larger group, you've just got to make sure that the facilities are there and so forth. So we were able to find a place through some relationship that we had, just a gracious family that offered up their family compound to us so that we could facilitate that. So that got booked. There wasn't one person that was booked for a drop zone in the fall of 24, but we booked the venue 7 months before the event.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was a faith piece for all parties involved. Operation Restored Warrior, our small group of guys called Wholehearted. And we just knew that God was in this. And so we were just taking steps of faith. So it wasn't because we had great registration or, we had budget line items that we could allocate to bring in people or whatever that looked like to facilitate. However, when we started promoting it, within a month or two, Operation Restored Warrior was willing to provide a registration landing page for us on their website. We did the same thing for ours. All of a sudden, different guys started signing up. Now, there was a group of guys that came from Hope Church, the couple campuses that we're connected with. However, there were other guys that were being tapped on their shoulder. So we had guys that were coming from Tennessee. A couple guys came from North Carolina. There was a group of guys that had found out about it that were being asked to consider it. They came up from Florida. We had 3 come up from Florida. And then just a cross section of us from the church that we were connected with. And so there was 25 plus that came together for it, that were actually going through it, the actual drop zone, with multiple facilitators. So Operation Restored Warrior, Paul and his team came in, and he was gracious to bring in 6 or 7 different ones, including himself, to help the key facilitators. And then he invited us as part of some of the small groups of our cadre to just to serve and help in whatever capacity, which we did. And to see what God did in that group of 40 plus guys that connected was just so, it was like you get a picture, a little glimpse of heaven, because you've got guys coming from all these different states. A number of them do know each other. A number of them did not know each other. But yet they came in, they felt welcomed, they felt like they belonged. And over the period of 4 days, and again, it was an intensive 4 days, but over the period of 4 days, new relationships were established. Guys that probably you wouldn't find hanging out together were building levels of camaraderie that they needed and didn't realize they needed. And the relationship that happened even between those that were going through the drop zone and the facilitators was great. So whether it was Paul hanging out with some guy that he didn't know, but that had come up from Tennessee or was from South Carolina, that was a neat thing to see happen as well. And it happened with the other ones as well, whether it was Big John or Jordan or Tom, different ones. Troy was there. And so I was encouraged to see all that. So for me, being able to look around and going, wow, God, you wrote this story. I had a small piece of it, as other people did, but he wrote the story. He opened the door. He provided the venue. He moved upon Operation Restored Warriors' hearts, moved upon our hearts, provided all that we needed plus, so this could happen. And some of the story quick takeaways have been a couple guys.
Before you get into stories, I want to ask you a question. So your personal drop zone, you went with 6 guys, and you said it was intense. Seems like it's intense. It's 6 guys, and there's more team there than there are guys going through it. So of course that's going to be intense and intimate. Now then you do your online program with your cadre. Now this is, I don't know, more than 6 guys, but not a whole bunch of guys. It's online, but you know each other. So I could understand how that would still be intimate. then you start to bring other people through it. And it seems like that would be a step away from the intimacy that is necessary for that level of trust and heart healing. And now you're going to throw 40 guys in a room. I mean, it seems like it's not the same. It just didn't seem like it would work the same. What do you think about that?
And all your points are very valid. Your questions are valid because it was the questions we were asking ourselves. Paul
It's
was
the
asking
questions we've been asking as the ORW team too.
Exactly. Paul and his team has been asking the same questions. It's not that it's not a possibility, but the question is, will it work? Can it work? Should it work? And so as we were going down this path, making the commitments that we'd already made, and as we began to execute, even that first afternoon, that first evening, we started, if we were willing to kind of take a step back and go, wow, there's some synergy starting to happen. There's some connection starting to happen. And you're not too far into it. You're maybe after your first session, you've had a meal together. And again, you got to have great food. So
yeah,
let's
that's
be
a
very
plus.
clear about this. It was not a fasting opportunity. It was more of a feasting opportunity. However, the reason I bring that up is because there's something that happens around a dinner table. There's something that happens around a breakfast table. There's something that happens when you're up at 6 a.m. and you're grabbing coffee together. You don't know this guy, but you recognize, hey, you know what? There's just 2 or 3 of us hanging out. Let's just connect. What does that look like? So those pieces started happening. And I'm grateful for the facilitators, for the ministries that came together to provide such an atmosphere of hospitality to where I believe the guys came in recognizing, first of all, they were seen.
Yeah.
They weren't obscure. They had a name. We knew a little bit of their story. And we valued who they were, no matter what they came in with, whatever their baggage, whatever potential pose that, and we struggle with that at times with guys. We were just going to love them where they were.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt that just broke down the walls, irregardless if it was a group of 6 or a much larger group. And you can say, well, how big can you go? That's not for me to make that call. But I do know this, that what seems impossible with man is not impossible with God.
Yeah.
And that's something that I felt personally presented itself, is that God was saying, watch me do what I do. You make your plans, as it talks about in scripture, but I direct your steps.
Yeah.
That place to where all of a sudden God started doing things and it was like, oh my, this is working.
Yeah. It does work.
You know what I mean?
Like,
against, wow, how does that happen?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important to stress that this is a program that Paul and his team have been relentlessly refining for 17 years. They've gotten a long run to get things right. And it's all dialed in and it's tight and it's good, but it would definitely be, I think, a sinful oversight if we attributed the incredible success rate of the Drop Zone program to the program. I mean, it's for whatever reason, Jesus has chosen this as a vehicle of healing in our time. And it's his. And what we had all those questions, just like I was raising, but what we decided was, can Jesus show up in a group of 12, a group of 40? Can Jesus show up in a group of 100 or 1,000 or more? And Jesus can do whatever he wants. And we were testing his anointing, his blessing on this program. And he's been faithful to show up. He's been faithful to show up all the way. And why don't you paint a little bit of a picture of what that looks like by sharing some of the stories from that large group experience that really was like, what, 3 weeks ago? 2 or 3 weeks ago?
Yes. It was just earlier in the month, considering we're moving towards the end of October here in 2020. I mean, there's so many stories. I'll try to isolate a couple of them. One in particular was a guy that was connected to our men's small group. Great guy, but didn't feel like he fit. And it started coming about more. He was kind of strongly encouraged to come. He's like, all right, I'll come. Didn't have a lot of
Pressured
expectations.
into it.
Yeah, kind of pressured into it to a point, but he did say yes. So the pressure was there, but he ultimately had to opt in or opt out. He opted in. But as he showed up and he's listening to the stories of the facilitators, and the facilitators were sharing personal story. A lot of story was tied into their time in the service and so forth. And he's like, I just don't connect with these guys. I don't have that kind of past. And so there was these kind of excuses being made.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, he leaves this one particular session, and I believe it was Big John that had said, hey, there's a donkey that's on the other side of the fence. It was a large compound, and there was some property around it, lots of property. And he made this comment. He goes, hey, maybe God will speak to the donkey, through the donkey to you. Guy took it as a joke, right? However, he literally took a chair, went hundreds and hundreds of yards in a whole nother direction where there was this donkey. And I won't give you the whole story, but over a period of a day and a half, God literally spoke through this donkey to this guy. And I'm going to tell you right now, there's that story about Balaam and the donkey and so forth. It was so real to this guy that it literally cracked him in such a life-giving way, because he came in saying, this isn't for me. And there's one part of the story to where he was writing something down, and he was just kind of struggling with seeing himself as a warrior. And when he put the period after it saying, I'm not a warrior, it was like the donkey screamed at him, literally screamed at him. And it was this reminder, and he'll express this. So if you need the story confirmed, I can.
Oh, no, that's great.
But literally what happened is it was God's way of saying, you are a warrior, Ben, you are a warrior. And then there was another time where he got up and he was just asking the Lord. He goes, Lord, are you with me? And the donkey walked from 75 yards up pasture down to him. And he would get up and walk and stop. And the donkey would walk alongside of him and stop. Then he would walk, the donkey would walk with him and stop. Yeah. And he felt like the Lord was reminding him, he goes, Ben, I've never left you. I've never forsaken you. I am with you. And so that was just one of those stories where you're like going, this is crazy. But you know what? God will use the foolish things.
Yeah.
Right? Found the wise. And Ben was like, I thought I went in all set. And I realized God was just setting me up.
A very common experience.
Yeah. So that was one story. Another story was, and again, understanding some of the backgrounds. His story, the gentleman I shared who had the encounter with the donkey, good family life overall, not a lot of crazy stuff, but there were other things God wanted to bring healing to, right? And so God did and spoke to him directly. Another guy had gone with some high expectations. He said, I'm going to be all in. I'm really going to go in and just take he took, copious notes, was really engaged, really receiving. But as he was receiving, things started coming up in his life, and some of his background started coming up and bubbling to the surface. And he started realizing that God wanted to bring healing to these areas. So a week after the event, he's sitting in our small group, and we'd done like an open kind of table forum of like, hey, tell us what the drop zone, what did it do for you? And he went on to share how changed he was, to where his wife had actually approached us and said, he came back a different man. I remember how he went, but my husband who came back is a different guy. And when your wife can comment on
that's the test.
That's the test. And you might be able to snow a lot of people, but you're not going to snow them. And so that was so just revolutionary for him. But it was for us too, because again, we're seeing the fruit of these guys walking in the fullness of who God's created them to be.
Yeah.
It's a no holds bar. It's an all in. And that was just powerful.
Man, that's good. Well, the one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on, and the main reason is just because you're an awesome guy, and I got to know you a little bit, and I've been wanting to do more with you. But one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on the podcast is because Operation Restored Warrior is actively looking for partnerships, exactly like what you and Mark Patrick pioneered at Hope Church. We are looking for churches or ministries or groups that we'll come to you. And if we go through a program to prep and to partner, we're looking to expand our reach. Like we talked about, Operation Restored Warrior has been healing 6 guys at a time for years and years. But we feel like the Lord has said it's time to expand. And so we're looking that's why we created the online program, which can be used literally by anybody, anytime. And that's also why we're trying to partner with churches and ministries and groups to bring the same program that Rich has been describing. So you don't have to be a pastor. Great. If you're a pastor, you can make this happen faster. But Mark Patrick is not a pastor. He's not on staff at the church. And he was really the initiative that got this ball rolling that I won't say has ended, but has at this point gotten to a big event at Hope Church for the men of that church. And who knows where it'll go from there. So if you are into this, if you've been through a drop zone, if you go through the online program, if it just sounds like what you need, we are open to partnering with you. And so you can reach out to us. Again, here's that website address, www.operationrestoredwarrior. There's a contact us button, and just reach out and say, hey, I'm curious what it would take to get ORW to my event, to my ministry, into my church. We're looking for that. All right, so we're pretty much out of time. I just want to throw the ball back to you one more time, Rich, to see if there's any sort of parting words or final observations you want to throw before we close.
I think based on what you had just shared about inviting other people into it, whether they're a pastor or not, I'm just grateful that the Lord opened my eyes to someone like Mark Patrick. So be very aware of who is potentially in your body, if it's your church, in the ministry, who is in your sphere of influence. Like, don't discount who God might be bringing in very strategically to set you up to go to places you didn't think you could go, but for such a time as this. And that's the one thing that I'm seeing happening right now in our nation and in our world. It's for such a time as this that God is wanting to see a generation of men be all they are called to be, not to cower, not to hide, but to go for it and recognize that he is the one who's leading, right? Yeah. He's the one who's guiding. And if we're willing to get on his train, not our train, his train, he will take us to places that have seemed impossible, but they are totally possible with him. So that's just how I'd want to encourage each and every one that would be connecting not only to this podcast, but to Operation Restored Warrior, that there are incredible opportunities for partnership. There are incredible opportunities to see the men that you're connected with. It could be even just you and a small group of guys.
Yeah.
Hold on a second. I want to go to deeper places. I want to be the husband God's called me to be. I want to be the father God's called me to be, the grandfather God's called me to be, the leader he's called me to be. Even if you have already, perhaps from your opinion, reached a pinnacle, think about it when God takes you to the higher places. So just a word of encouragement.
That's a really good word. And I do want to clarify one thing as we sign off. We've been talking about, I love what Rich just shared about, like, now is the time. This is the season. If ever we needed men to stand up and be healed and whole and capable of serving and leading, now is the time. And he did this all with men's groups. We've been talking men. But there is a women's program too. If you go to the website, when you go to sign up for your online program, it's going to ask, do you want to do the men's program or the women's program? And we have women facilitators. We have not yet done the kinds of group event that we've done with Rich's church, with women, but we're looking for that opportunity. So don't feel left out, ladies. So that's it for this episode of the R3 Podcast. Rich, thank you so much for making time for us. I really appreciate it.
Honored.
Awesome. And we'll see all of you next time.